Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're wading into a pretty big pile of sources, articles, legal briefs, economic reports, court docs. We're looking at something really complex, moving super fast. The U.S. tariffs rolled out this year, 2025, and the major legal fights happening right now because of them. Our goal here is to cut through all the noise, really unpack what's been going on, both with the policy and the courts. Why are these tariffs facing so many challenges? What are the potential impacts? Think of this as your shortcut to getting up to speed on this whole kind of tangled issue.
Okay, let's unpack this. The beginning of 2025, it saw a really rapid rollout of new tariffs by the administration.
That's right. The sources kind of lay out a timeline. It seems things really kicked off back in February. You had initial tariffs on Canada, China, and Mexico then. And the stated reason, the official line, was combating fentanyl and drug trafficking.
Okay, fentanyl. And then things ramped up pretty quickly after that.
Oh, yeah. March saw increases. A broad 20% tariff on Chinese goods, 25% on imports from Mexico, other Canadian stuff too at 25%. And then mid-March, another 25% specifically on steel and aluminum.
But the really big move, the one making waves, came April 2nd, right? What the sources are calling Liberation Day.
Exactly. That policy introduced a minimum 10% tariff, and this was on imports from almost every country. Initially, Canada and Mexico were exceptions, but pretty much everyone else was hit. And about 60 countries got even higher rates.
Wow, okay. And the rationale for those tariffs?
For those, the stated goal was different. It was about balancing the U.S. trade deficit.
And this is crucial. The legal authority they pointed to, especially for those big April 2nd tariffs, was the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA.
Right. And also on April 2nd, remember, a 10% tariff hit Canadian potash and energy as well. So a lot happened that day.
So what does this all add up to? What's the scale here?
Well, the analysis we looked at, they suggest that with all these 2025 tariffs piled on, the average effective U.S. tariff rate climbed to 22.5%.
22.5%.
Yeah. And that's apparently the highest that average rate has been since 1909. So it's a really significant level.
Yeah.
And it impacts, a huge range of products coming in from tons of countries.
Okay, so here's where it gets really interesting and why we have all this legal material to sift through. These sweeping tariffs, especially the April 2nd ones, relying on IEEPA, they almost immediately sparked major legal challenges.
Mm-hmm.
The core question everyone's debating in court is basically, does the president actually have the authority under IEEPA to do this kind of thing?
Yeah, that's the fundamental question. Is IEEPA, the right legal tool for slapping on these broad universal tariffs? I mean, IEEPA itself, it goes back to 1977. It gives the president power to regulate economic stuff, but crucially, only during a declared national emergency.
A declared national emergency, okay.
Right, an emergency that has to stem from an unusual and extraordinary threat that comes from outside the U.S. That's the specific language.
And the sources are pointing out this is like the first time a president has tried using IEP this way for broad tariffs.
That's what they highlight, yeah. First time used on this kind of scale for tariffs. And the challengers argue, look, the law doesn't even explicitly mention tariffs, and past presidents just haven't used its emergency powers like this for general trade policy.
Okay. So what are the main legal arguments against using IEPA here? What do the sources say?
Right. So the core arguments you see in the filings, they kind of boil down to a few key points about presidential power in the Constitution. First, is it even an emergency? Challengers are saying, look, the reasons given, like trade deficits, which have been around for decades, or even fentanyl trafficking, they don't really fit IEPA's definition of a sudden, unusual, and extraordinary threat.
They're saying these are ongoing issues, not sudden emergencies.
Exactly. More like normal ongoing problems, as one source put it, or a normal state of affairs, not a true emergency that triggers IEPA power.
Okay, so that's argument one. The situation doesn't meet the legal definition of emergency. What else?
Well, beyond just interpreting IEPA, there are bigger constitutional questions. The Constitution, Article 1, explicitly gives Congress the power to regulate foreign commerce and to lay taxes and duties, not the president.
Right, the power of the purse.
Exactly. So the challengers argue that using IEPA to impose potentially trillions in new taxes through tariffs is effectively an illegal usurpation of legislative power. It's the president taking over a job the Constitution gave to Congress.
And I saw mentions of specific legal doctrines in the court papers related to this.
Yes, a couple come up frequently. One is the major questions doctrine.
Okay, what's that about?
The basic idea is if the executive branch is making a decision with vast economic and political significance, and huge tariffs certainly seem to qualify, potentially $1.4 to $2.2 trillion in tax hikes over a decade.
Yeah, that sounds vast.
Right. The Supreme Court has said that for those kinds of major decisions, Congress needs to have spoken clearly in the law to authorize that power. The argument is that IEEPA does not clearly authorize the president to impose tariffs of this scale. It's about whether Congress really meant for IEEPA to be used this way.
Okay, so Congress needs to be explicit for huge policy shifts. And the other doctrine?
That's the nondelegation doctrine. This one puts limits on how much lawmaking power Congress can just hand over or delegate to the executive branch. The argument here is if the president can just label longstanding issues an emergency and then impose basically any tariff anytime for any reason, well, that gives the president almost unlimited power. Challengers say that's giving away too much of Congress's core power to tax and regulate trade, and it crosses constitutional lines.
So pretty fundamental challenges being raised. How did the courts initially react when these lawsuits started pouring in? We saw names like VOS Selections, Detroit Axle, Learning Resources, even states.
Yeah, import businesses were definitely filing, but also states like Oregon and California got involved. And the initial response from some of the lower courts was pretty striking. The U.S. Court of International Trade, the CIT, which is the specialized federal court for these kinds of trade disputes, they issued a big ruling on May 28th. It was in cases that were grouped together, including VOS Selections and the state of Oregon. And a 3-judge panel there decided President Trump had exceeded his authority using IEEPA for those sweeping tariffs.
Wow. What was their main reasoning?
They basically said IEEPA doesn't give unbounded authority to do things like impose taxes or regulate foreign trade on such a massive scale. They felt the universal reciprocal tariffs went beyond what IEEPA allows, even under its regulatory powers. And interestingly, they also said just using tariffs to create leverage on issues like border security or fentanyl wasn't enough. The law requires the action to actually deal with the threat more directly.
So based on that reasoning, what did the CIT do?
They issued a permanent injunction. Basically, they ordered a permanent stop to those reciprocal and border security tariffs.
A permanent stop. That sounds definitive.
It was a major ruling. And then just a day later, May 29th, you had a separate ruling from a federal judge in Washington, D.C., Judge Rudolph Contreras. He was looking at a case brought by a couple of small businesses, Learning Resources and Hand to Mind. And he also declared the IEEPA tariffs unlawful.
Another judge agreeing.
Yes, though his order was a preliminary injunction. So a temporary stop-blocking tariff collection just for those two companies while the case went forward. What's also interesting there is that Judge Contreras refused the government's request to transfer the case to the CIT, so it raises questions about, which court is actually the right place to hear these challenges. Jurisdiction is complicated.
Right, and we saw reports that other district courts did dismiss cases, often sending it to the CIT, but California is fighting that jurisdiction issue on appeal too.
Right.
So clearly the legal fight was just getting started. The government obviously appealed these initial rulings.
Oh, absolutely. They appealed quickly. And this brings us closer to where things stand right now. As of around June 10th, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit, that's the appeals court, that reviews decisions from the CIT they weighed in. And this was a big development. They ruled to allow the Liberation Day tariffs to actually stay in place while the appeal is ongoing.
Wait, so the lower court said stop, but the appeals court said no, keep them going for now.
Exactly. They granted a stay, extending an earlier temporary pause. The Federal Circuit specifically mentioned the issues of exceptional importance involved. And underlining that importance, they decided the full court, all 11 judges, will hear this appeal together, not just the usual 3-judge panel. That's called hearing it en banc, and it signals how seriously they're taking these legal questions.
And when will they hear the arguments?
That crucial hearing is scheduled for July 31st.
Okay, July 31st. What about the other case, the one in the D.C. court?
That ruling is also being appealed, but to a different appeals court, the D.C. Circuit. And Judge Contreras, the D.C. judge, he actually paused his own preliminary injunction while that appeal happens.
Okay, so let me try to summarize the legal situation as it stands right now, based on the sources. Lower courts, like the CIT and that D.C. judge, found some of these broad tariffs are likely unlawful, exceeding IEEPA authority.
Right.
But the appeals courts, particularly the Federal Circuit dealing with the main CIT case, have put those rulings on hold. So the tariffs are mostly still being collected while these higher courts really dig into the fundamental questions about IEEPA, presidential power, and the Constitution. Is that about right?
That's a good summary. The legal battle is intense and ongoing, but for now, the tariffs largely remain in effect pending these appeals.
Okay, so while the lawyers duke it out, what does this actually mean on the ground? For businesses, for consumers like you listening, what are the tangible impacts, especially with all this legal uncertainty?
Yeah, the sources definitely get into the economic consequences, things already happening or projected. A really key point you see repeated is that these tariffs act like a regressive tax.
Regressive meaning it hits lower-income people harder.
Exactly. Because tariffs are taxes on imported goods, right? Those costs often get passed straight through to consumers in the form of higher prices on everyday things, and that takes a bigger bite out of the budget for lower-income households.
Do we have any numbers on how significant that impact might be?
Yes, the Yale Budget Lab analysis that's cited, it gives some pretty specific estimates. They project that just the April 2nd tariffs could cost the average household about $2,100 a year. And if you factor in all the 2025 tariffs, that projected average annual cost jumps to around $3,800 per household. And that's in 2024 dollars.
Wow, $3,800. That's definitely not small change.
Yeah.
Are there specific types of products expected to see big price jumps?
The analysis flags things like clothing and textiles potentially going up 17% under all the tariffs, food prices maybe 2.8% higher, motor vehicles maybe 8.4% higher. So these are costs you'd likely notice directly as a consumer.
Absolutely. And what about the wider economy, beyond just household costs?
Well, the same analysis projects a hit to U.S. real GDP growth in 2025, maybe half a percentage point reduction just from the April 2nd tariffs, potentially almost a full percentage point, 0.9 from all the 2025 tariffs combined. And the projection is this leads to a persistently smaller economy overall in the long run, something like $100 billion to $160 billion less in annual GDP.
A smaller economy, and exports too.
Yeah, U.S. real exports are also projected to take a significant hit long term, potentially down 10% just from the April tariffs, maybe over 18% lower if you include all the 2025 tariffs that stick.
So slower growth, fewer exports, higher consumer costs. What other kinds of fallout are mentioned in the sources?
Well, there's discussion about damage to U.S. trade credibility globally, and also impacts on the U.S. dollar. The dollar had apparently weakened, which makes imports more expensive anyway, and reduces U.S. purchasing power abroad. It can also make the U.S. seem less stable for foreign investors.
Because all this uncertainty adds risk.
Precisely. Businesses and investors, they really need predictability, right? For
Right.
long-term planning, for making investments. And the sources say this sort of on-again, off-again nature of tariff policy, combined with the legal cloud hanging over it, just makes everyone hesitant. It can dampen investment.
And it costs businesses just to deal with the confusion.
For sure. Importers face significant costs just trying to navigate the situation, figuring out what tariffs apply, when. Sometimes they even have to take legal steps now just to preserve their rights to maybe get refunds later if the tariffs are eventually struck down permanently.
And I think I saw something about even pauses in tariffs causing problems.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. A temporary pause, like the one set to expire, can actually cause a rush to import goods before the pause ends. Businesses try to stockpile, and that sudden surge can clog up ports, drive up shipping costs, and even add to inflation temporarily. So, yeah, the whole situation creates ongoing economic turbulence while the legal side plays out.
Okay, so a lot of domestic economic impact. How are other countries handling all this?
Yeah.
Especially China, which seems to be a frequent target.
Well, according to the sources, Beijing seems to feel it's actually gained some leverage recently, perhaps viewing themselves as having won the latest round by showing they can withstand the pressure. But more significantly, China seems to be actively adapting its whole trade strategy because of the tariffs.
Adapting how? What are they doing?
They have apparently been working hard to build up trade relationships elsewhere, especially in Southeast Asia. There's talk of a transshipment hub strategy. The idea is Chinese goods might surge into those Southeast Asian countries, maybe get some minimal work done there, and then get re-exported to places like the U.S.
Trying to find a way around the direct China tariffs.
That seems to be part of it, yeah. Finding alternative routes. The sources also suggest China feels it learned that U.S. supply chains are still quite dependent on Chinese goods. And they might see that dependence, that Achilles heel, as one source put it, as something they can use in future negotiations.
Interesting. And it's not just the government.
No, reports also mention Chinese small businesses are increasingly looking at setting up manufacturing outside China themselves, rather than just waiting for trade deals to change things. So adaptation seems widespread.
Okay, so lots of moving parts. Legal battles, economic effects, international adaptations. As we look ahead, what are the key dates or events we should be watching for next, based on these sources?
Yeah, there are a couple of really big ones coming up soon.
What should we keep an eye on?
First, July 9th. That's a critical date because it's when that 90-day pause on most of the big reciprocal tariffs from April 2nd is currently set to expire. If there aren't new trade deals made or another extension announced, tariffs on goods from many countries could jump dramatically. The example given was goods from the EU potentially facing a 50% tariff.
50%, that's huge. Okay, July 9th, what else?
And then, probably the most important date for the core legal fight we've been discussing, July 31st. That's the day the full 11-member Federal Circuit Court is scheduled to hear the arguments on the legality of the IEEPA tariffs in that big CIT appeal.
Got it. July 31st for the big appeals court hearing.
Yeah, the outcome of that hearing and the eventual ruling will be a major signal about where these legal challenges are headed. It could ultimately end up at the Supreme Court down the road. But yeah, this deep dive, it really lays bare this complex web-connecting presidential power, how courts interpret laws like IEEPA, and the very real economic impacts on global trade, supply chains, and ultimately, the prices you pay for things. It shows just how much is riding on how the courts decide these really novel legal questions about tariffs.
Absolutely. It's a powerful reminder that trade policy isn't just some abstract economic concept. It really intersects with fundamental constitutional law, with international relations, and, with our everyday household budgets. Trying to navigate all this information, it really requires separating the signal from the noise. Hopefully this deep dive has helped give you a clearer view of what's going on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Thank you.
And here's a final thought for you to chew on, something provocative maybe. As the courts are busy debating the precise legal limits of executive power and trade policy, what is this reliance on really complex, often very slow legal challenges and appeals? What does that mean for the kind of stability and predictability that global commerce really seems to need in our modern world? Something to think about.